We're starting off with the idea of social design, and we'll discuss if social design can help us make institutions more inclusive. We have with us today Sandhya Naidu Janardhan. Sandhya is the founder of Community Design Agency, a social enterprise that envisions an inclusive world where every human enjoys access to vibrant, safe, and healthy spaces to live, work, and play. Most of Sandhya's 15-year professional career has been about cultivating processes that provide marginalized communities with clear agency and voice over where and how they live. Her previous work spans multiple countries in both the commercial and not-for-profit sectors. We also have with us Sudarsana Kundu. Sudarsana is the managing trustee of Gender at Work India. She is passionate about supporting institutions, both within the private and public sector, to drive a diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda. Over the last 2 decades, she has advised several organizations, including several UN agencies, to evaluate and assess the impact of their workplace policies, practices, and cultures on gender equality. Welcome to you both. I would also like to spotlight our Indian Sign Language interpreters, Saurav and Preeti, who will be interpreting the session as we go along. So once again, thank you everyone for tuning in. Before we get into the discussion, I would just like to also acknowledge our own position and the space that we occupy as individuals who are having these conversations, as individuals who are interested in the complex ideas of diversity and inclusion. So just to start, I was wondering if you both have any thoughts on that, if you'd like to share a quick comment, Sandhya and Sudarshana.
Sure, maybe I can start and then Sandhya, over to you. So, obviously I'm extremely privileged to be here talking to Sandhya today on this issue of social design and inclusion. I have been bestowed with certain, sit back a bit, reflect, pause, and actually have these conversations with these amazing people. And, it's a privilege to kind of think of something, a space like Circle Back, where we can actually have conversations with people who have such diverse perspectives on their work. And just the journey that I've had over the last 20 years with such a an amazing set of people who are every day striving to change the world and make it a better place. That is an incredible privilege that I've been a vantage point, and being able to take all of that in, absorb it, and then get back into my own work and apply those insights from all these great thinkers, great doers. That's an amazing privilege. And we'll continue to talk about our privileges as we go through as well in our conversation. But Sandhya, thank you so much for joining in. Let's hear from you as well.
Thank you, Sudarshana, and thank you, Shambhavi, for that introduction. First, I would like to thank everyone who's joined us in this conversation, giving their valuable time to listen to us. What I'm expecting and hoping will be a reflective, sort of almost an inquiry-based conversation, if you will, to address the privilege acknowledgement sort of idea that Shambhavi opened up with. I completely echo Sudarshana's sentiment. I think certain choices that our families and our society has made around us enabled people like me to be in this position to have this conversation and also be able to do the work that I'm able to carry out. And at the same time, I think it's always this constant, not so much a struggle, I think, but I think it's about that having that sense of awareness in terms of where you are situated, right? I mean, in certain areas around the world, it's important that we take the opportunity of being able to occupy space and really do that sort of justice to the representation of where I come from, for example. But then in my area of work, my bread butter, again, that's kind of a privilege that I have, that I'm able to do this and, live, is that it's again sitting with the communities, then that intersectionalities of what it means to be privileged kind of shifts and changes. So for me, it's sort of something that's always there at the back of my mind as part of my way of life. And for me personally, there's no one answer, and it's a constantly evolving notion or an idea.
Thank you, Sandhya, for that. Thinking about this as an evolution, a conversation, it kind of ties in so well with our theme of circling back, because we're always reflecting, reiterating. That's really the idea of Circle Back. So, warm welcome to everyone. We're starting off this wonderful theme, this wonderful set of conversations with Sandhya today. And Sandhya, social design has been around for a long time, but it may be a bit of a novel idea in India. I know there are people who've been working in India as well, and you're one of the leading lights in this area in India. Can we start with what do we mean by social design, or even more so, how do you understand social design?
Yeah, social design has so many different definitions, and I think it's important to talk about how I view it and what it means to me. But before that, to talk about social design as a novelty, it's truly sort of a democratic process. So I think if we are functioning the way we should be functioning in terms of our commitments towards society, it's that sort of process of constant evolution, right? And maybe in sort of institutional and very structured centers, it doesn't happen. But then if we look at certain cultural outlooks in terms of how certain people in the country live, you'll see traces of that, right? In terms of how a village comes together to build a person's roof, right? And I think that's sort of social design that happens, right? And where people build their own homes and then everybody pitches in. Or there are societies where a newlywed is sort of they're helped with setting up, and the whole community comes together, not just their family, but the extended society comes together. Of course, it's not a perfect system. I don't think any one society is so perfect that we can say, okay, this is it. But it's that constant evolution. But I think the term social design is sort of coined in a way that it's become very popular. For me, social design is a two-way relationship. I think what I see as one of the misconceptions, if you will, is how it is applied in certain areas where, you want to convince a group of people to make a certain decision. But I see it as a two-way process. So if we as practitioners go in thinking that, will the community be willing to change? Will they be amenable to change? That question needs to be asked of ourselves as well. Depending on what we discover, are we willing to change, right? So it's definitely that two-way relationship. That's how I look at social design. And I think it's also what I find unique about that process is that it varies and changes depending on each person's lived experiences, each person's sort of upbringing, or what kind of society and background that they come from. The beauty of it is that practiced, you're going to see very different outcomes, if you will. So it's not they say it's not top down, but it's not bottom up either. It's kind of that inside out, a way that you kind of bring it to all the stakeholders, irrespective of what kind of power structures they sit on. So, for example, a quick anecdote is we're working with a community in Ahmednagar, and we wanted the residents of that particular slum neighborhood to come along with us on a journey around participatory process and to build their homes. But it was very clear to me that I had to sort of apply the same process to the city officials as well. So the exposure visit that the families got, the city official got the same thing. So it's really about that bringing everybody into the fold.
Right. So it's almost like in terms of a community, and you kind of think about who that community should be involved in that process, in this thinking process, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah.
I just wanted to quickly add that, the thing is, when you say social design and participatory process, what immediately comes to mind is marginalized communities and working with the underprivileged, people. And the fact is that this sort of process can be applied irrespective of, social status, economic status. It's for everybody, right? So I think we need to kind of break out of that thinking that, oh, it's only for the economically weaker sections of the society.
Yeah, and that's such a important part, right? Because we always kind of think of social design something for that bottom 10%, and it's not really meant for that other set. It's how do we kind of make their lives better, but we're not always applying it to ourselves.
Yeah.
And we'll kind of get back into this two-way design and dig deeper a little bit. But before we get there, Sandhya, what drew you here? What kind of attracted you to this idea of social design? And take us through a little bit of your journey on this arena. Yeah.
I mean, I've kind of quite frequently reflected on it. Like how there is this whole theory that your kind of worldview or how you're going to situate yourselves in the world gets shaped, when you are quite young, right? And who did sort of, intentionally or unintentionally influence you, if you will. So that's something which I've always reflected behind on. And I would like to say it's my grandmother, right? It's about how she engaged with different people whom, with whom our lives intersected with, and how she sort of treated them, and the way it's a simple act of like, feeding a dog when all the neighbors were driving the dogs away. Right. I mean, something as basic as that. And I know that it has an impact on me, or even in terms of how people who helped us run the household, or, we owned cows. I know, and I was, I think, 5 or 6, I think, when the last set of cows were sort of, they passed away because of old age. And then the family changed the business model, if you will, of buying and selling milk. But, I just remember how everybody was treated, and how everyone was sort of, how my grandmother especially treated everyone, irrespective of how the rest of the household behaved, right? So I think very early on, that was sort of ingrained in me, but it was not in any formal sense, right? So that kind of carried on, through schooling and college, university, in terms of the kinds of topics of study that I was interested in, and the areas of focus that I chose for a seminar or a debate. And it was always also structured around social issues. And also my own personal experience from a space perspective is that, as a family, we moved quite a few times, having lived in the same city because of our financial issues, if you will. I mean, we were not left for wanting. I mean, I'm not trying to paint like the sorry picture, but the spatial impact that, the impact that space has on you is something that I realized very early on. And I'm very privileged in the sense that the decisions that my parents made in terms of putting me through education and, wanting the best for me, really helped me in sort of getting access to, very, very good education, if you will. And now the journey into the social design part is sort of, in a way, it looks like a pivot, but it almost seems like, my life experiences kind of were leading up to it. I graduated from my master's in 2008 when the housing economy crashed and the housing market crashed. And that was really bad. And I was in the US at the time. And just out of practicality, right? Again, I don't want to wax poetic about how I ended up there. Just out of sheer practicality, as a student, you get 1 year permission to continue to live in the US. And that's when I came across a design nonprofit. And I heard a talk by the founder, and I said, if the buildings are incredibly inspiring, if they're very beautiful, I will go there and see if there are opportunities to, get a job or volunteer first. And just then, a number of buildings, homes that they had built had won awards. And that for me was so powerful, because usually what we see, even in the Indian context, because there were sort of social, or even there are social services where, you get schools built or homes built by the city, by the government, and somehow, the excuse when building for the economically poor is poor building. So that's something that was not enough for me. So that kind of set me out on that path, where participatory design was also an aspect of rebuilding after disasters, or rebuilding in disenfranchised neighborhoods. So that's sort of how I got into this space. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer. But
No, not at all. It's kind of given us a perspective into thinking about how we look at, and it kind of is a wonderful segue to what I want to ask you next, because you talked of the impact that inclusive space has on you, and that was a constant feature in kind of thinking about, even as you're thinking of architecture, what does this space mean? One of the things that we kind of, as an example, when we're talking of unconscious biases in our sessions, we talk about how city planners think about cities, right? And the way that they kind of and often design it in gender blind manners, often prioritizing those which are people, not only gender, but people who possibly don't use the city as much as the rest of them. So, how do you use design principles when kind of conceptualizing inclusive space? How do you take those? What are some of the principles that you then use to look at the space, and how does that process unfold? If you could talk to us about that.
Yeah. So before we even enter into the spatial strategies, it's really to understand the socio-cultural and socioeconomic layers within a community, right? And I had learned from an example, from another practitioner, an architect who was working in Tamil Nadu after the tsunami. She was sharing how they had the participatory process, and then they started noticing that when they would have the whole community come in, the men were talking the most. Mm-hmm. And the children had no say at all. And the conflict was because everything was washed out. So they were asking the men to demarcate what they thought was theirs, right? And it was always like there's this landmark, and whatever leftover landmark was sort of used as that point of, the milestone that you call, right, to evaluate what belonged to you and didn't belong to you. And she said this anecdote had always stayed with me, because it's informed how we end up designing our own processes. And a lot of the men were fighting because they said, this is our share and this is my space and your space. It was very interesting. And then what she did was she decided to then break the group and, invited only the men first, and then documented the discoveries from that. And then she invited only the women next. And then, the way they were perceiving space was so different from how the men looked at space, because they had sort of to do a lot of walking. So they were getting very close to what the sizes really were. But I think, again, as being adults, they thought, oh, you know what, we can actually try to get more than what belonged to us. And really the true mapping came when they sat with the young folks and the kids, because they said, this is what was my sort of courtyard, or the extent of the courtyard. Look at that tree there, which is standing, and that's the extent of where our home was. So I thought that was such an interesting experience, and it's informed us, because when we look at social design at the community level, it's really important to understand the relationships, interrelationships, and the intra-relationships within the community before we really move into spatial design. So we apply, and it also varies, right, depending on the user groups as well. If it is street vendors from a business perspective, livelihoods perspective, it is a very mixed gender scenario. And it's very interesting to see how, especially women, have a say and occupy space, versus if you're looking at a different type of engagement, let's say for homes, and then we have noticed where the women are quiet and the men sort of speak up more. And then, we kind of have to navigate that as the process unfolds. So the inclusivity part, I mean, it varies depending on what our spatial interests are. And as a result of that, we have to constantly tweak the process.
And then when you start the process, what are some things? How do you start thinking about, places of, how do you kind of think of what constitutes an inclusive space? Are there specific things that you look out? What you've just described in a way when we're doing sort of thinking of projects in the development sector and, and I'm talking about broader development, and also in particular when we think about projects or programs when we talk about gender equality, this idea of looking at what is the context, where are you situated, who is there, how are they located, what are their needs, and really being participatory about that process of understanding everybody's needs and how they kind of relate to what we want to achieve is central to how we conceptualize or design anything, right? So that just echoes so well with how we also kind of start thinking about any kind of, project or anything that we start off with. But once you're there and once you've started kind of looking at the state, how do you kind of conceptualize? Are there some principles which kind of you use to kind of say, oh, this is what would be inclusive? I know you said that it depends and it varies. So maybe if you can tell us a little bit about how that varies.
There's not any set principle as such, right? But one of the things that is becoming very prominent is to design, if you want to design for accessibility, you kind of design for all kinds of sort of physical challenges that people face. And now we're also looking into mental health, right? So universal accessibility is under the assumption that we're all, we all have some kind of physical challenges, or physical disabilities and then we're going to experience it in our lifetime, right? I think that notion of designing based on how you are today, or how I am today, versus to be able to visualize yourself over your lifetime, it becomes very important, right? So then when you look at the community group, we kind of have to address the ones who are probably the most disadvantaged in that scenario. If within that framework, if there are not discrimination, but sort of differences, very clear differences. So based on that, while there are no set principles, but I think what we want to make absolutely sure of is that we have engaged with a variety of groups and all of the groups in the community, right? And again, whether it is women only or whether it is the people from from the tribal community, then what happens, and then that's a different kind of group. So to do it that way, and also spatially, to engage with them in terms of what are the good things in that community, right? So because of our nature of our work, we are trying to solve for problems or challenges, if you will. And I think the development sector kind of looks at it that way. But when we start engaging with the community, we're also very curious about what they think is incredible and amazing about their communities. And then we start from there in terms of, okay, how do we then enhance that aspect, right? So for example, I'll just share a screen to show you a visual of one community. So this is a slum, community in Ahmednagar, which is about 250, 300 kilometers from Mumbai. This is where Ahmednagar Fort is situated in the city, which is where all the freedom fighters were imprisoned. And Nehru wrote his book, the seminal book, when he was imprisoned there. So, it kind of, I'm sure most of the people who came to this talk have that general interest in that area and have seen a slum. And when you look at a slum community, and when you go in as a practitioner to solve, you're kind of solving for the problems and the challenges, and you see these are very kind of, this image where there's no access to clean water, but they're using what they have and is right outside their home. And you'll see that, there is that sort of dirt outside their home, and there are two kids, washing and doing household chores. Just sort of the lack of basic infrastructure where they have to struggle to store water every day. And just going back to this visual, I think I should describe it because we have the interpreters here. This lady who is, drying clothes on her roof, which is very, very precariously just standing on it. It's literally, the visual looks like she's holding up the roof, right? This very elderly woman. And this particular visual that I'm sharing, which, has this tin shed just very delicately balanced on top of a very unsafe structure. And poor infrastructure, of course, flooding and no adequate drainage. All the things I think most of us who are in this session are familiar with in a slum-like condition. Spaces are poorly ventilated. They have to keep their lights on throughout the day, right? It's actually quite expensive if you think about it. But, it's so important to focus on what is right and good about the community. And this visual shows, goats and dogs and children, all of them outside. And it's this beautiful social space because the homes are so small. People actually spend most of their time outside. And, a lot of these, I only half jokingly say this, but when the moment urban planners and architects go into these neighborhoods and try to formalize them, and I'm, using air quotes, we actually end up sometimes bringing inefficiencies, right, into how the spaces are used, because the way communities living, with very few resources have really maximized how they live there, how they kind of use what they can in what they have in the best way possible. So this visual has, somebody who's setting up to heat water, but then there is the neighbor with her daughter sitting there with an infant. And again, there are animals and there's storage outside. So the way I look at it as a very efficient use of space, right? You're occupying very little area, as a result of which the carbon footprint is also very, very low. And again, that's sort of, the joy that open areas bring to kids. Over here, it's a visual of kids playing and they're teasing someone who's walking along the way. And I know it was in good spirit because I was there when I took the photo. But to how to keep all of this. And this particular community has 22 different groups living together, castes and religion. And when you kind of look at, providing permanent formal housing, it immediately translates to these drab high-rise, buildings, which, how do you make community in that? So to acknowledge, the good things about this neighborhood, and then how do you engage with the community to understand their aspirations, and not so much to, we don't have a home, so let's get the four walls and the roof here. But also, how would you envision a home where, for us, the idea is we ourselves live in that space. So when you talk about social design and applying those principles, that's why I say it's a two-way street. So it needs to be good for any of us to live in that space or work from that space. And that's really kind of, the different principles very broadly that we apply when bringing about, transformation within these neighborhoods.
Sandhya, that's wonderful. There's so much, and maybe if time permitting, I'll pick up on some of those. But when you're kind of thinking about, and you kind of talked of this two-way processes, space, kind of identifying, speak to everyone and, make sure that you center the most marginalized in a way, right? And that so much kind of, again, aligns with many of our feminist conversations, because we kind of say it's not really about, if you can actually solve for the most marginalized in a way, you'll be able to kind of actually think of the problem more holistically, right? That's fundamental to how we all kind of function, I think. How is this social design in a way? Is this only meant for spaces and architecture, or can these design principles be also applied to other social processes? In particular, as you know, we are kind of working on with institutions, with organizations in a way, right? can some of these principles, or maybe if you can glean out some of these principles, maybe we can think about how we can possibly apply them to organizations.
Yeah. So thank you for that. And that's something which even I have been exploring and working on at an organizational level as well, right? Because bringing in ideas and principles of social design in areas of work which are so entrenched in sort of that hierarchical way of operating. If you look at a regular architecture and engineering firm, and we're not that, we kind of are a group of people who come from a very wide range of backgrounds and experiences. But I think from a societal perspective, need to define, and it's like, what's that one thing that you do? And it's seldom that one thing, because and I think this extends to a lot of different issues. Like if you look at maternal health, it's not that one thing. It's not just prenatal health care. It extends to what kind of family support do they have, and what kind of nutrition they have access to within sort of the earnings that they have, or even do they go back home and do they have access to safe sanitation facilities? It's not really that, they have access to a gynecologist. So similarly for space as well, it's complex, right? So social design, the artifact that comes out of design in our case is the building, right? But the social design is actually a creation of, you're creating social conditions that you not redefine, but I guess reevaluate and maybe redefine once the whole group is ready, what it means to have a different kind of social construct or structure, right? So it's about dealing with the cultural issues and social issues, and it's really people driven, and how it transforms people along the way. So each of these projects that I've worked on, and I'm sorry I won't be able to show too many of these today, it's brought transformation for us as well as people and as an organization. And within the organization, how do you then work towards providing space for multiple voices to emerge, and not to have that very decision-based one person. And in the architecture field, we have the hero architect syndrome, right? That one person will just draw on a napkin and then they'll be like, this is what gets built.
Ayn Rand for everyone.
So how do you, what would the response to that be? And I'm not saying it's easy, right? And I'm not saying this is the best solution, because what you also then what you're also faced with is groups of people, or people who, who you work with, and including ourselves, we come with a certain level of social conditioning. And you cannot shake it off immediately. So then what is that process of hand-holding? And I think in most cases, we sort of discount it, especially because, I went to an Ivy League college, so therefore I know what's good for everybody. Or because you're trained to think that you are the expert, or what needs to be done. So how do you then dismantle, or, not reverse, but not dismantle, I don't know if that's the right word, but how do you then sort of nudge, those kinds of minds to move into a much more egalitarian, democratic way of operating? Because social design also has the capacity of, if it works, quickly enough, I'm not saying well enough, I'm using the word quickly, it can shift power structures. But at the same time, nobody is above the idea of when power gets to you, right? So how do you make sure that it's constantly evolving? And we have seen situations where, someone who kind of started off as the person who didn't have a voice, and we said, okay, let's focus on giving that person the voice, right? But it's important to remember that they actually occupy a very, very patriarchal society, and they have seen examples of leadership. We're giving them the tools. We are not spending maximum amount of time with them. So to set examples of what true leadership means, it gets very muddled. And then because they have the tools, they quickly start emulating what they have seen in their neighborhood, in their society, right? And that can become quite dangerous very quickly. So as exciting as it is to bring this sort of thinking and this kind of approach to our work, what I'm also understanding from my experience is you need to be very careful and have that commitment that you're going to be there to handhold, because it can be detrimental. It's not always going to be all great. And individuals' personalities and attitudes, considering all of that. So it's actually, it is in fact actually quite, and I'm making it sound tedious, but it is, you do have to give that kind of attention to this.
No, Sandhya, there's so much that kind of resonates again with the work that we do, and which is why we're having this conversation, because, a lot of what you're talking about, in terms of just now what you kind of talked about, this hero architect syndrome, we see this in the leadership. And when we think of organizational design, there's this one leader who's going to solve all your problems, rather than kind of thinking of it as a collective issue and how do you kind of make sure that we're all thinking about it together, right? There's always that tendency, and we're driven saying that you have to be the leader, you have to be that one leader who's going to kind of, and everyone's striving and everyone's being told to be that individualized person who will take decisions on behalf of everyone else, right? And how do you break that? You're talking about how do you kind of create these spaces which people feel they can belong to. You can't create spaces where there is such formality that people stop feeling that they're human beings in spaces. We also see that with workplaces, right? That you dehumanize them so much. But how do you keep that human in those spaces and make those spaces for connection, spaces for belonging? Again, something that we kind of trying and really think about. And this process, it's a process. There's no silver bullet to any of these solutions, right? When you kind of work with trying to think of what an organization, an inclusive organization, we can't say, do these two things and you'll become an inclusive organization. It's just such a process of thinking, reflecting iteratively, that we have to kind of be there for that gradual change, shift, and again, kind of, restarting once again. So much in terms of how we all like to think about it. Over these years of experience of social design, and, maybe take us through some of these examples, how you now been working with communities, this must have also changed the way that you think of what social design is, right? And what design principles should be. How are you kind of thinking about social design itself, or what social design can do, what it should be doing, what does the future of social design mean, and how can that be maybe more inclusive, maybe more contextual, more grounded? I don't know. I mean, how are you thinking about, you've now worked for 2008 to now 15 years of working on this?
I think it's changed in the sense that communities definitely are willing to be more vocal if provided with the opportunity and the opportunity in the platform, the right kind of platform, if you will. And also, I think in India, there's been a big shift in even cities willing to open up their master plans for commenting, and even before they finalize it, it's not a draft. Even before they write it, they're willing to take feedback, right? Or, willing to take the feedback, whether they work on it and implement it or not is another conversation. It's a different conversation, if you will. And in terms of, understanding how it changes and how it should, right now, it's again, while it is shifting, it's not enough. You're able to bring in, let's say, participatory design and social design within certain aspect, but how does that convert to, let's say, land issues or financing issues? Banking, so the systems that spaces are bound by, those systems are still very rigid, and we're trying to sort of make our way through those rigid structures. And then within that, then how do you find the right partners to say, okay, there's a little bit of an opening in terms of, how can you shift the way, for example, financing works for housing. So it's definitely a long way for us in terms of making it even more widely used and As a, we continue to be, it will take time, but even like, institutional, not there yet, right? Wherein you can say, okay, social design and democratic decision making or facilitating, all voices are included. So I think there's a long way to go, and each and every one can play a role in that. But from my perspective, I'm only very, very positive and hopeful that that kind of change and shift will come in. And I think the last 3-4 years, the experiences from, whether it is a pandemic or even, other geopolitical issues, it's pushed all of us to rethink how we live our lives, what we thought were non-negotiables, right? And we are a population that is right now, hopefully, at least enough number of people are acutely aware of what's, permanent and what's not permanent. And, what do you want to focus on as individuals, and how do you want to bring about change? And I think with again, of course, this is inclusivity and gender, but climate is so become such an intrinsic part of all aspects of our lives. So I just think that if we don't take this approach, the burden falling on, a small group of people, we're just going to crash. So the best thing to do is sort of to distribute. I mean, social design processes also distributes accountability, Mm-hmm. It has more number of people who can, who feel accountable also because of a sense of ownership that they have for the possible solutions that come up and for the ideas that they want to pursue. But it's also a more sustainable one, because then it's not like, again, going back to that one leader and that one person, and when you set out to listen. So I think there are lots of benefits of taking this approach.
And talking of climate change, and this February was, I believe, the hottest in recorded history, India's recorded history of, weather. So we're definitely in the midst of that. There's no getting away from that. And when we think about climate change, again, there's no denying that the implications for it are to be borne by the most marginalized, right? Mm-hmm. And in many cases, these are women, these are people from the indigenous groups across the world, many of whom who are facing climate-induced displacement, whether man-made or otherwise. But all of that experiences is what they're having to kind of bear. What is something which is the change that you're seeing, which is positive? Like the change that you're seeing is positive. What's giving you hope around social change and social design thinking, or in terms of how people are talking of inclusion, maybe. However, what you see from your work, and if there are examples of that positive change that you can share.
Yeah, from my work, actually, I don't want to speak on behalf of everybody as such, but I definitely see more, thanks to social media and the way information flows so easily. I'm definitely seeing incredible initiatives throughout India and the world. And sometimes, of course, I also have to be wary that it shouldn't be in my own small echo chamber, right? Because we are interested in certain topics and then you keep seeing the same thing. So being cognizant of all of that, I've just come back from our organization hosted an arts festival in Govandi. It's considered the ghetto of Mumbai. It's one of the most marginalized areas in the city. It's in the northeastern part of the city. And what was incredible was to see how quickly the youth and young adults, grabbed that opportunity to, demonstrate that they're beyond just their struggles and all the problems that you hear about that neighborhood, and that they're able to celebrate their own talents and their own way of expressing themselves. So a really quick anecdote, like one of a journalist from, I can't remember which newspaper, but he was in the neighborhood, and I said, "Oh, great, you're have you ever been here before? And he said, oh yeah, I've done hundreds of stories about crews in this neighborhood. And this is this is one of those, very rare moments I'm seeing such a powerful, can you still hear me?
We can hear you, Sandhya.
Okay, that powerful, that to him, he was just beaming, right? He said, this is so powerful that the youth are here. They wrote original content for rap, and there were photographs that were taken. And looking at those photographs, for the audience, sorry, I'm just describing this, but you're welcome to see it on Instagram. It's Govandi Arts Festival. I would, as outsiders, we would never view spaces like the way they did. And it kind of proved the very premise on which the festival was based, right? Or even the filmmakers, the young filmmakers. I was standing there and I was wondering, what was I doing when I was 14? And there was this young kid who's made an entire film, and the lens with which he looked at it. So just even giving the slight, the tiniest of space, the smallest of opportunity can create that kind of impact. The impact, I think in terms of a couple of visuals I want to show. So basically, this is what the neighborhood is, right? I mean, it's tightly packed on just 5 hectares. So on an average, 6 to 7 people live here. And the streets, the buildings are very closely with these public housing neighborhoods. This is what it looks like between the buildings. And so this gives you a sense of area looks like. And it was sort of engaging with the community for over, and we failed with them, and we were able to consistently and make sure that they understood sort of how they could have agency in terms of how they use their space. And over here, you can see what it's filled with. And these are less number of cars, because by then all the taxis had left when this photograph was taken. And the taxis come back in the night. So the day view is usually like this, but imagine 3 times more number of cars.
Yeah. So we lost you for a bit. Yeah, so this is the image that you want to show, because we didn't get to see this. So this is the image with the public housing. This is with, and this is with 5 hectares with 7 to 8 people in each house, right?
Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
So let me just go back to the visual again. Hold on. So did it get stuck here, the screen?
Even before, it got stuck in the first picture of the.
Oh, okay. I'm hoping that it'll work this time. So this is what I was trying to show you, is the buildings which are closely spaced, and the sort of what the neighborhood looks like. And I won't dwell into, we don't have time to dwell into why it is this way. It's sort of a combination of poor design and social policies failing, etc. And, to give you a better visual, so, we kind of worked with the community on smaller initiatives early on. We, succeeded with them, and then we failed with them. And when we did the arts festival, we were able to, because of the kind of passion and the kind of drive that the youth brought in, the adults were very motivated to have a great space for the arts festival itself, right? Which was a culmination of 6 months of work with the young. And they decided to, can you see the next image? They decided to take on the largest space in the community and say that we want to reclaim this space to host the arts festival. And they don't have any open areas, and it's pretty difficult. Each of the apartments are 226 square feet, where on an average 5 to 6 family members live. And for me, it was a very, very important milestone, because in their 15 years or 20 years of living there, they hadn't sort of even thought of, how to take on this space. And this is what we had for the arts festival. And post the festival, the community came together and they said, we want to make sure to keep it, and retain it for the community. So the kind of impact that we're seeing is, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that it takes a long time. It's a long sustained effort. It's not something that happens very quickly. I like to use the phrase patient development to, if you really want to see the changes. So that's why, again, social design is almost like an antithesis to how we want to see, these metrics. In 10 years, we're going to fix these many number of issues, and it seldom works like that.
Yeah. No, this is incredible. This is kind of the change. It's remarkable. And what one art festival of bringing people together can do slowly. Even to get to that, that's taken you a long time. So thanks so much for that, Sandhya. We'd love to open it up to some Q&A questions that, we do have people who've been working from, in the field of social design. There are people who've worked in the field of gender, and the people who've been working with institutions for a while. Some of them from Gujarat, many of them that had come here were from Gujarat. So any question and answer. That it also includes the gender at work team, anything from
yeah, and I'm sorry about the technology.
No worries. These are things that we all have to live with.
I'm glad that this discussion was also, it read as informal too, because you were quoting instances from, your own work and experience. And along those lines, I wanted to know if you could give another example of how the community actually gets engaged in the social design process itself. So in the past, whatever projects that you worked on, or the way you're trying to inculcate these principles, what is their role and how can they become active participants in the process?
The way I look at it is that they are active participants, right? Because we learn so much from them as well. You create that space and they understand that it's sort of that exchange between, from the ones who are from the outside and them. It's just that we have certain access to resources that we can bring into the communities. So it takes time though, because the general perception of nonprofit work or NGO work is that you're going to come and give something to us and, we're going to get free stuff. And this is not, I'm not saying this in a derogatory manner, or that it's just how the culture of the development sector, the charity model has worked, right? And what we do is we're saying we're bringing services. And for us, we know a pivotal moment when a community comes with an issue or a spatial problem that they want to solve for. And then they say, hey, can you work with us on this? And that's when we know that kind of shift has happened and that we're not there to distribute things or, just bring in money. And that's much more powerful because the community they always have the capacities and the capabilities to take charge, right? It's just that the daily negotiations of life, it doesn't give you that space or opportunity. So when we bring in these kinds of initiatives to the marginalized, like to incredibly marginalized neighborhoods, for example, this Mumbai project, the community, we, finished up the arts festival, wrapped up, and, we're continuing our work in the community. It's not the end of it, right? But, we said, okay, we need a few days off because it was such an intense event that we did. And what I kept getting, texts and phone calls was about how people who generally didn't engage with our programs, they were all in that area from morning to like late in the night to make sure no one was parking their cars. And then everybody came together, right? So that's where they have taken, the community ended up taking charge of what is rightfully theirs to begin with. And we were not there to tell them, oh, this is what you do, but it's really that process of working with them, that process of sort of engaging with them over a period of time. It's like, hey, this is something which we can make happen. So but it's definitely a two-way process. One of the things that I didn't, that it's very, very important is that vulnerability, right? That you're willing to be vulnerable with the community, right? You ideally don't go in with the position of power. It doesn't matter, right? As a human being, you connect it at a human being level. And that is what opens doors for transformation. And I've seen that in my own personal experiences. When you're respectful of certain practices and cultures, and this is where it gets very interesting, because it begins to challenge your own principles and value systems. But then you have to situate yourself in that context and then evaluate your principles and value systems. And then, it pushes you to stay quiet. But then you're struggling, right? It's like, oh my God, I should have said something. But is that what the group of women wanted? Because they will tell you if they want you to intervene. And that's very important to understand. Right. So that respect that both parties extend to each other is important. I mean, really quickly, like I worked with sex workers on helping understand, not just for them, but for us as well, what does it mean to have a safe and healthy place of work, right? When I initially went in, obviously there's a lot of suspicion. I went with a very strong social partner who's been working with that neighborhood for many years, but there is that hesitation, right? But so when I went in, they were very hesitant to show me their spaces. And I also felt like, oh my God, I just walked in and I said, show me the spaces where you work from. And that was very insensitive of me, right? Mm-hmm. But from my perspective, I'm seeing that, oh my God, these women are actually providers for their family. And I kind of, in my head, I'm thinking, oh my God, they are in their own way, considering all the challenges, and not to minimize the complexities of the issue around sex work. But the fact that they left their homes and they were doing what they were doing, it was not out of disrespect, but I was just like, show me your spaces in the second visit. And over a period, and by the time we finished our project, I kind of had to even correct myself in terms of how I was engaging with them and iterate my own process. And also like my own sort of thinking had to go through that transformation. And people are very perceptive. So by the time we were done with the project, we wanted to evaluate the impact. And then the women were like, come see our spaces now, how clean we're keeping it. And I wasn't there, but my team members were there. But that kind of transformation, right? Because then they're willing to accept. Of course, if I may say so myself, I have an amazing team, really, really strong women and very thoughtful and sensitive women who work with me. But that is sort of, where that it's become that two-way street, and that it's the engagement is sort of from both parties.
Thanks, Sandhya, for that, extraordinary example, right? It's an example, and it also again resonates with the work that, Shambhavi, Jyotsna and I do for gender-rich work, I may say, where we kind of talk about how as process facilitators, we need to come to a space to be vulnerable and have the journey. It's a co-traveler, right? You're actually journeying with the spaces that you walk into as well, right? And making them feel equal ownership of that process, right? So that's so incredible to hear. We have maybe quickly, I think Omkar's question is about what are the intangible aspects of dealing with social housing projects. I think you've dealt with a little bit of that in your conversation. But one of the other questions that Manasvi has is about that, she's wanting to do a master's in social design. And she's considered about, non-traditional design background, and because everybody she hears is an architect and she doesn't come from that field. So who can be a social design practitioner?
I think that word design can be misleading, right? Because we call it social design and participatory design. And usually, I think the immediate response is it has to do with making something and building something. And that's where I think it becomes very limiting. But I've seen applying, that's where I think as a counter, there's something called human-centered design that comes into picture. But again, the word design is design being the operative word, if you will, over there. So I think the principles of, social design can be applied to a very wide, pretty much to everything, right? Even on your own family, if you want to, because if you want to create that environment of how can everybody have an equal voice or agency over how decisions are being made. It's that sort of, comes from an inquiry and a curiosity point of view, right? That's what defines the starting point of social design. And it actually looks at strengthening relationships. So when you're implementing projects, no matter what type of projects, if the intention and the ideas where the intangibles are all of these, right, has an idea or a solution been truly collaborative? How do you make sure that it's truly, like, even if, let's say, you are coming up with a solution for, you have a small group of women and, they all want to become storytellers. Or they want to start their own cooking business. So there are certain principles that you apply, like the curiosity and the inquiry comes from what's each of their background. And when you start from there, then, it starts contributing to what the menu should be, if you will. It doesn't come from the perspective of this is the cuisine we're going to choose, right? So that curiosity kind of leads us to that discovery. And then has everybody contributed to it? That's sort of the collaborative process. And in the process, it's not going to be easy, right? Because there's so much emotion involved. There's so much of your own mind and soul and heart. Everything is poured into it. There is sort of the dangers of relationships also failing, because how do you then resolve it? So if it's leading to strengthening relationships, it becomes one of the principles that guide how you establish that framework. So it's kind of unfortunate that it looks like only people who are architects and designers who are using this, but definitely the principles of it, you can call it anything, you can rename it. We can come up, maybe circle back by the time the series ends, you can come up with new phrases for all of this, right? So it becomes even more accessible. Even by the fact that you're calling it, there's social and there's design. I also have an issue with it, but you kind of have to pick your battles carefully, because social design suddenly makes it seem like it's, like I said early on, it's applied to a small group of people and this alternative thing. And we're saying that it shouldn't be an alternative thing. It should be how we all operate anyway. So yeah, I mean, it's just called that. I mean, please feel free to rename it and call it.
Let's see if we can. Maybe if people who are on this, if they have some suggestions and thoughts, share it our way. But again, it will be fun to hear from all of you. But again, Sandhya and Mansi, to your question, some of the principles that Sandhya has talked about is people who worked on organizational, working to build cultures of equality and inclusion within organizations. So many of these principles are exactly how we also operate on building a relationship of trust, acknowledging that those can also be fragile and can break, being vulnerable, going through this process, being iterative. And this is really our, endeavor with the Circle Back series, is that learning from other principles and other frameworks and other, people who possibly we don't always see as being part of the same sort of institutional organizational design narrowly. We also want to get out of, being very narrow in terms of how we think about organizational design, and kind of really think about it as a process. It's really a holistic process of engaging with people who are in that space. Like you said, it's a two-way process even for us. It's not you come in as consultants and say, here are the 5 things you do, right? This is a meaningful engagement. So I know we're well above our time. So there are lots of questions which are coming up now. And there's one more question. So wondering whether we can actually take some of these questions offline.
Sure. I mean, we could take, if I don't know, let's ask Shambhavi. If we can take one last question from Namita, if that's okay. And I think,
sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
And
that actually also speaks to Omkar's question in a way about catalysts and intangibles. So if you can maybe take that.
Well, what can I say? It differs. In some places you have to drink copious amounts of chai. In some places you have to drink copious amounts of Coca-Cola. So I mean, it's again, I don't want to make it sound very simple and easy, right? Like, how do you convince donors that you require a team to spend 3 months just talking to people to even uncover their needs. Like, yes, if you're a health professional, you know that there are some fundamental issues in the community. Of course, if it's life-threatening and if it requires immediate attention, that's a different conversation. But I'm talking about sort of well-being in a broader perspective. How do you convince a donor to say that I'm going to just spend 3 months with this community just uncovering needs? Because what we do is we decide what the needs are already, and then we go into the community. The catalysts evolve through that, the catalysts that come out organically when you're actually spending time there, and there is, whether it's a moment of celebration when they're there with you and they see how, you know, you're so open and willing to sort of learn about different cultures and you want to sort of embrace it, or if it's a moment of crisis and they do turn to you and you're able to contribute, but being fully aware that, you know, that whether it's in your area of expertise or not, that's very important. You can't just deep dive and say, okay, you know, yeah, let's fix this problem. That's a drainage problem as a, you know, a technical engineering problem. You can't do that. But the key catalysts, you know, they change with every, they vary with different projects, but it's the process that kind of is that allows you to, you know, get on that journey. And that's something which we all, like for me personally, but also as an organization, we're trying to figure out, like, how do you close that gap, right? You may think that, oh, this community needs 50 toilets. And then they're like, no, we want 1 Anganwadi and 12 toilets. Then you have to go and completely change it. But then they're like, the donor is like, no, but you guys do sanitation work. How can you build an Anganwadi? So it's not that easy. But again, to directly answer your question is to have that willingness that you would have budgeted half an hour because you had only 3 questions and you actually end up spending an hour and a half. But what does that mean financially and what does that mean from a scheduling perspective is a very interesting debate and a conversation. But what I've also seen is that when you spend that time up front, it compensates over a period of time when you actually work with the community and start co-creating some major initiatives. And that moves pretty quickly. So it's sort of this, it's unfortunately a fairly tricky situation because usually what they say for participatory design is, as experts, we'll be like, okay, these are the 50 toilets, this is where we're going to situate it. You already have a plan. And people think that showing the plan and convincing the community is participatory design. And it's not. And, you know, then you wonder why it failed, right? So I'm sorry that there's no direct, easy way for this, but I think as communities who really believe in this way of operating, it's kind of up to us to convince, you know, the ones who can support these initiatives as we go along.
No, these are dilemmas that we all sit with, and hopefully one conversation we'll have at some point is on flexible funding, because that's something that, you know, we all have to struggle with, because you go into a project, you want it to emerge from those conversations, but let's see. So thank you so much, Sandhya, for a fascinating conversation. Shambhavi, back to you.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. Once again, thank you to both of you for taking the time and just engaging with the idea of social design. I mean, through the series, like Sudarshana said, we really want to just start these conversations and also keep coming back to them, because it's such a reiterative process. So we have to keep thinking about new ways and old ways as well of engaging with our everyday realities. So we really hope that this conversation can just contribute to envisioning, you know, inclusivity, newer models of inclusivity in both places, workplaces, and processes. And thank you so much to everyone who joined us. We're really excited to take this forward. If you have any questions or comments about this session or the series, I'm sharing an email ID in the chat box. Please feel free to write to us and we'll try our best to, you know, reach out to you. I would also like to thank Saurav and Preeti for effortlessly interpreting this entire session. And next month we'll come back, we'll circle back with a new theme and with a new speaker. So once again, thank you to everyone and see you next time.
Thank you. Thanks, Shambhavi. And Get back to us with ideas, suggestions on what you'd like to hear about, what topics should we be talking about. And thanks for staying with us.